Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the third webinar in our Arbor Day series. My name is Gwen Kozlowski, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program. We have many friends of our program in attendance today, but for those of you who are new to us, the UCF team is a collaborative effort between UVM Extension and the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. We provide technical, educational, and financial assistance to support communities in stewarding their tree resources. You can learn more about our work on vtcommunityforestry.org. Before I hand it over, we've got a few housekeeping items, and for those of you who've already participated in our last webinars, forgive the replication, but your microphones will be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to put them in the question box in the side panel, and we will address them after the presentation. If you have any other comments or concerns, feel free to put those in the comment box as well. Credits. This presentation is eligible for 1 ISA and 1 SAF or Vermont Forester licensed CEU. To receive credit, you must fill out the survey with your name and license number. The survey will pop up once you exit the webinar and will also be emailed to you 1 hour after the presentation. So if for some reason it doesn't pop up when you close out of the webinar, you will get emailed the survey 1 hour after the presentation is complete. And I know everyone's been getting a ton of emails these days, so I'm trying to minimize the number of emails you receive after the webinar. So if you'd like an SAF certificate of attendance for SAF or Vermont Forester, it's available in a handout in the handout box in the GoToWebinar side panel that you could download yourself. But again, if that doesn't quite work on the post-webinar survey, just check that you need an SAF certificate and I'd be happy to email one to you. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website later today, vtcommunityforestry.org. And we are delighted to have so many of you on today. And a great big thank you to Paul Schaberg, the plant physiologist from the USDA Forest Service, who will be leading our webinar today. He was so kind to navigate some technical difficulties, and I really appreciate his energy and effort and enthusiasm to be here today. Before I hand it over to Paul, I just wanted to do a few quick polls to get a sense of who is here in the audience. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll, which is, who is present today? Right, you could go ahead and take a few seconds to fill this out. I know we've had some technical difficulties with folks before. Another 10 seconds or so. All right, we've got 40% here to learn a little bit more, 45% arborist, forester, or arboriculture professional, a few representing municipalities, and a few volunteers. All right, the next poll are where folks are located. And since I was only able to have 5 responses, I kind of broke up the state by counties. So let's see, and didn't do it completely properly, but did the best I could. I should have put in a question here, who still has snow on the ground? All right, we'll give another 10 seconds. All right, so we had about 32% in Northwest Vermont, 36 Central, about 20% Southeastern, a couple from the Northeast Kingdom, and a couple from Southwestern Vermont. Excellent. All right, and one last poll. Where are you at with virtual education opportunities? Great, please keep them coming. I sign up for the ones that are of particular interest. I'm webinared out, and there's so many, it's hard to keep up. I'm just kind of curious to get a sense of where folks are at. We are going to be planning another 5-week webinar series, and I might fall in the category that there's so many, it's hard to keep up. We'll go another 10 seconds or so. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. Wow, 52%. Great. Please keep them coming. 30% sign up for the ones that are of particular interest. A couple people are webinared out, right there with you. And there's the few folks that say that there's so many it's hard to keep up. So I agree, and I appreciate all of you attending today. And thank you again so much to Paul. I'm going to hand it over to you. We are excited to hear some good news during these trying times.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. This is a story I really do like to talk about. It's a story of the decline and then, well, unexpected decline, a mysterious decline of red spruce, but then its recent resurgence. And it's a story that will have a kind of a historic flow to it, but also focus on some of the biology and science behind both the decline and the rebound, because that's what I do. So I'll be mostly talking about work by myself and others at the U.S. Forest Service, but a whole slew of scientists and students at the University of Vermont. A lot of the work I'll be talking about was done by graduate students working in my lab. So first, a little primer on just what red spruce is as a species, because it provides some context for what I'm going to be talking about. Red spruce is a temperate evergreen conifer. You can see the foliage down the bottom right-hand side of your screen. It's important that I emphasize it's temperate and evergreen, because our work has shown, among other things, that red spruce can somewhat surprisingly kind of like wake up and photosynthesize and gain carbon at some unexpected times of the years, in fall, late fall, even in midwinter if there's a thaw, and certainly in spring before the adjacent hardwoods even leaf out. Although it has that unusual capacity, it's also a highly shade tolerant species, and because of that it can persist for decades in the understory before release, and that shade tolerance and ability to persist makes it a component of the climax forest for its range. But I'm going to talk about its range in a second, because its range is in question. And part of that reason it's in question is because red spruce is a valuable timber species. It's also used for pulp and paper. It was even used for instruments, as a sounding board for guitars and violins and other instruments. But because of that timber value, and also because of just land clearing for agriculture, it was heavily logged in the 1800s and the early 1900s. We don't entirely know how heavily logged that is, but we do have indications from looking at population estimates based on witness trees that folks used when they were surveying the initial land in the range of red spruce. Also by looking at logging records at places like the port of Burlington. And one estimate is that maybe 90% of the red spruce trees were cut down for either timber or land clearing. So significant population depletion, and that significant population depletion causes this uncertainty about the range. So this is a range map of red spruce at the top right. You'll see it's shown to be in the 1970s when this was made to be in a contiguous population up here in New York, New England, and coastal and Canada. But it exists, at least in the 1970s, in these weird little island populations that go down all the way down to Tennessee. So this uncertainty about the range is important, because one of the things that projecting the future and the health of the species that we do is use these ranges to estimate the climate envelope, what environment the species is most adapted to and might fill moving forward. But if we think that this is the only place that red spruce exists, then we get one estimate of its adaptation to the environment. But if instead we think, oh, it probably filled in a lot of these gaps, it's this little island population thing doesn't make sense, then we may really misunderstand and underpredict its future. So I'll just end this by saying commercial species. Red spruce was an important commercial species in Canada. but much less so in the United States. In fact, in the United States, it was most noted for its decline, coincident with acid deposition. So a quick primer on acid deposition too. Most folks may know this, but it hasn't been in the news so much in the last 30 years. So burning of fossil fuels puts sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides into the air. Those oxides mix with water in clouds, creating acid deposition. That could be rain, it could be acid snow, it could be acid mist, like in fogs on mountaintops and clouds. And that acidity comes down and it has consequences. For our story, for red spruce, the big consequence is it actually leaches important nutrients from these forest ecosystems, and it leaches it away so that trees don't have access to it. So important things like magnesium and calcium. Also mobilizes not so good things like aluminum and mercury and lead. So this leaching away of good things and mobility of bad things has effects. So what are some of those effects? So one of the things that people noticed early on was that monuments like marble statues and metal bridges and whatnot started being eroded, oxidized, and so it was thought, I wonder if this has to do with acid rain. The famous fish kills in many, especially high elevation lakes in the Adirondacks, so-called dead lakes, was due to the acidity leaching out and putting a lot of aluminum into those bodies of water, which was toxic to fish. It was actually even shown that in high elevations where the mountains are clouded in clouds a lot, that acidity could be breathed in by hikers and impact their lungs. So a lot of effects, but the one I'm going to be focusing on is acid deposition on tree populations. And specifically, the impacts on red spruce, because red spruce decline is the best example of how acid deposition can harm an important tree species. And this is kind of the timeline here on the side here. In the 1950s, there were field reports of foliar damage. It was red and dead foliage, noted especially in the late winter and early spring. By the 1960s, reduced tree growth was evident in tree rings. By the 1970s, folks were actually, through monitoring, noticing increases in mortality and reductions in reproduction from New York, New England, all the way down south to the Smokies in Tennessee. In the 1970s also, folks at Hubbard Brook Experiment Station, which I'll be talking about in a bit, actually by measuring the pH of just rain, just to get baseline data, noticed it was way more acidic than it should have been. So first place that acid deposition was verified in the United States. By the 1980s, acid deposition, people were wondering, is that acid deposition and the decline of red spruce, are they related? Which was reasonable because they were both occurring at about the same time and in the same locations. And also in the 1980s, because of this question, there was a large increase in research funding and the establishment of the USDA Forest Service Spruce-Fir Research Cooperative. So this was a really big deal, and this actually occurred about the same time that I was a graduate student. I started studying red spruce in 1982 as a master's student, and so I was involved with and aware of this program kind of right from the start. It was a $16 million research program, which back in the day, that was a really big deal. It resulted in many peer-reviewed articles. We learned a lot about what was going on, but also what wasn't going on. And these research articles led to a book synthesis, which is the books down here, which really tied together all those findings and also informed the 1990 report of the National Acid Deposition Assessment Program, which basically said, among other things, that acid deposition harms tree health and productivity. So that information, along with the information about the damage to monuments, the fish kills, the lung issues for people, led to a massive science, a big report, and then that informed Congress, and they made the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act, which down here you can see President H.W. Bush signing. So That amendment led to a significant decrease in pollution, sulfur and nitrogen, especially sulfur. Coincident, important to people like me who do research, it was kind of considered, oh, check, we've done our due diligence, and there was a big reduction in research funding. So that's kind of a timeline history of what happened. But I want to now transition to looking at what the science is, what the causes are behind all this, because that really informs the second part of the story. Why might the trees be doing better now? So I mentioned that acid deposition leaches cations from environments, from forest soils. So just as a quick idea of what that means. So forest ecosystems need calcium, magnesium, and other things to grow. They use that to create wood, to create the photosynthetic apparatus in foliage. And so it's important to have that. And forest ecosystems get that those cations through inputs, atmospheric deposition, mineral weathering of rocks, etc. But then they use that, they use those cations and deplete it from the soil by plant uptake to make wood and etc. Through hydrologic export, just a natural removal with water, and it goes into streams, etc. And also harvests. So things like the stems of trees concentrate a lot of calcium, and when you harvest those and remove those, you're taking it out of the system. So this is a balance of inputs and exports, but in an undamaged, natural system, that balance is either equal, so it's static over time, or usually actually accrues over time. But that system is disrupted by acid deposition because it leaches out those nutrients way more than the natural uptake and hydrologic export and harvest. And so you have a big imbalance. You have some coming in, but way more coming out of these various cations, including calcium, because I'm going to shift to understand the importance of calcium now. Indeed, it actually exports more calcium than those other cations. And that leads to depletion and then issues. So this is a little diagram showing the uptake of cations from the soil. It's magnesium, potassium, calcium, and trees take it up through the roots as the trees transpire and lose water, but these cations come up, get taken into the wood, go into the foliage, and they accrue over time. Now in the fall, many of these cations can then be reabsorbed back into the tree. And so the tree can be very conservative in keeping those important nutrients. And that's really good. It's just through the nature of calciums and its location in plant cells that calcium is not reabsorbed in. So calcium is not taken back out, it's not conserved, and instead when the foliage comes to the ground, it's down there, it starts to decay, it becomes mobilized, and then when you have acid deposition coming in, it can actually remove that from the site. So although the site may conserve many cations, it does not conserve calcium. So that means it's at particular vulnerability for loss, but it's particularly important because calcium is really important to tree health. So it's like I've mentioned, it's a structural component of trees. It's in the wood, for example. But more importantly for our story, it also has a regulatory function. The movement of calcium into and out of cells helps those cells regulate carbon metabolism. So leaves helps them regulate photosynthesis. But it's also important for stress response, for helping cells respond to stresses. And so knowing that, our group put together this hypothesis of how acid deposition and calcium depletion may make trees and forests more vulnerable to decline. Starting here at the top with acid deposition, you see acid deposition coming in, it depleting calcium in the soil. That means that we deplete calcium from trees. And that calcium deficiency leads to impaired stress response and carbon balance systems. So the trees become more vulnerable to stresses. And unfortunately, there are always stresses out in nature. So stresses like temperature extremes or drought or insect and disease problems are out there. And if you have an impaired stress response system and then you get stress exposure, that's a bad combination. And it leads to reductions in growth and increases in mortality. Now, for red spruce, as I mentioned, is the best example of this, although we have many others. That vulnerability, that other stress, is freezing injury. So this is a picture here of red spruce freezing injury. It's the mortality of foliage and sometimes buds due to low temperature exposure in the winter. So if you imagine, if you freeze your foliage to death and kill your buds, you gradually deteriorate the crown. You lose foliage. When you kill the buds, you lose the ability of having next year's new foliage. And that reduces the carbon capture ability. The carbon stores are actually stored in that foliage. That reduces growth, that increases mortality, and makes the species and can lead to problems. Now, some of this vulnerability is just inherent to the species. It's counterintuitive because red spruce grows in some of the coldest areas in our region, but the foliage is just barely able to tolerate the normal cold that the species is exposed to. It does typically tolerate that because that's why it's on the landscape. But this acid deposition calcium depletion reduces the cold tolerance even more, so it pushes the species past that threshold. It makes foliage that before acid deposition could have tolerated the cold, it makes it so that it can't, and we see this injury. So our lab, through a series of controlled experiments where we gave seedlings and saplings different levels of acid deposition, gave seedlings and saplings different levels of calcium into their soils, we were able to nail down the step-by-step process that leads to the damage of the foliage and the carbon relations of these plants. We showed by step to step that hydrogen inputs decreases biological calcium reserves. That loss of calcium does specifically reduce the cold tolerance. It does make those plants more vulnerable to winter injury, and that injury does lead to tree decline. So that was the series of experiments which culminated in this Bioscience cover article back in 1999. It was the first mechanistic understanding of what's going on. This was a big deal, but it was done on seedlings and saplings. So, it did leave a question about, so how is this relevant to, dominant and co-dominant trees out on the landscape? And lo and behold, in 2003, there was a very high winter injury event. This is a picture on the left that I took on a chairlift going up skiing. And I was just there with my wife and looking and saying, oh my God, these trees are really hammered with winter injury. And it wasn't just a couple of trees. In the right-hand panel, it's hard to see, but these red lines on this mountain ridge, that's taken from an airplane, and that's all winter injury on those trees. Seeing this vast damage, we went out to 185 plots and 28 sites in Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, and Massachusetts, and just did a survey across a big region, how much of these stands had winter injury in the dominant and co-dominant trees. And it turned out there was a lot. 96% of trees were affected and had winter injury. The average across this long range was that they lost 65% of their current year foliage. That's a lot. And what's worse is about 56% of the buds were killed. But this was a big range to look at, and the injury was not uniform across that range. We actually did spatial analysis, and we found that the injury was significantly greater at high elevations, western longitudes, and west-facing plots, all areas that received greater acid deposition. So that wasn't total proof, but that was very consistent with acid deposition being an issue here. But we had the ability to actually look at this much more specifically in an experimental setting, because at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, that place where they first documented acid deposition in the US, they had also calculated how much calcium that acid deposition removed from a watershed. So these are all watersheds, so they're drainage units on the sides of a mountain. So this is one drainage unit, that's another, that's another. This drainage unit, the reference, they had calculated how much calcium acid deposition had removed from the watershed, because they've been collecting watershed samples at the bottom, testing them for calcium, and were able to, then ramp that up, see how much calcium was lost. But knowing that, in 1999, they decided to add that calcium back to another watershed. So for this other watershed, they added wolastenite. It's a calcium silicate mineral that they ground up and was spread via helicopter. This was a big undertaking. This was very difficult logistically and otherwise to get this calcium all over the watershed, to do it uniformly. You can see, I hope, that on this side of the screen, that's all that wolastenite coming down and being on the watershed. This is the adjacent watershed where it wasn't spread. And we decided we were going to go in and look at winter injury in 2000 year, that big winter injury year, at the reference watershed where the calcium was depleted, and compare it to the calcium addition watershed where presumably the calcium that was lost from acid deposition was added back. And this is what we found. So this is winter injury over here, everything from 0 needles injured all the way up to 100%. This is the amount of winter injury on that reference watershed where all this calcium was leached over time from acid deposition. You see injury is there is almost 80%. And this is the amount of winter injury on that calcium addition watershed, where it presumably was brought back to the pre-acid deposition levels. And that was about less than a third of the amount of winter injury on the reference watershed. So a big difference. But we didn't just look at winter injury. We looked at a suite of foliar things that we knew that were impacted by calcium, things that might account biologically for that reduction in injury. We specifically looked for increases in foliar calcium, make sure the calcium is in there. And then we looked at things like foliar sugars, ascorbate peroxidase activity, series of amino acids, and all these factors being protective compounds in the foliage that help them deal with the cold and not be injured. So we looked at the calcium getting in there, all these protective compounds that calcium specifically helps ramp up, and then we compared cold tolerance, and it showed that calcium addition led to an increase in all these protective compounds and improved the cold tolerance. So very important. But in addition to looking at the biological background, we also wanted to look at the biological consequences. So what was the aftermath of the 2003 winter injury event? Especially we were interested in the carbon holding capacity of these stands. So we identified stands from that big survey of winter injury, stands that had the full range of winter injury losses from 0% foliage damage to 100% of the new foliage. And from those stands, we went in there and took tree growth rings. So we increment cores, that's just pictured down here in the middle bottom of the screen. And then we took that data from tree growth, measuring how much growth there was in these stands at 0 to 100% winter injury. And then we used that data, that specific tree-based data, to ramp up using forest inventory and analysis data to look at red spruce across the region. So the field sampling involved going to 30 plots at 14 locations across 3 states. And we had 2 plots per each of those 0, 10, 20, 30, etc. Winter injury categories. And this is what it looks like in general across those for all those categories combined. So this is looking at mean basal area increment. So that's looking at those tree rings and measuring the growth. You can see that there's a lot of variation in growth based on year to year. Some years the trees are growing better, some years they're not. We had data actually knowing which years there were some kind of winter injury event on the landscape. And you can see there are declines in growth associated with these winter injury events. And then this over on the far right, that's the 2003 winter injury event. So you can see this was growth in 2002. Then there was this big winter injury. This is the reduction in growth, and that growth stayed down for 1, 2, 3, sometimes even 4 years. So a significant reduction in the carbon being stored in the wood of these trees. So there's winter injury event. And then we calculated what that loss in carbon meant for trees across the region. So that calculation showed that for any one tree, there was a reduction in carbon, but it wasn't a big deal. At least in like looking at how many, how many grams of carbon there was less in a tree. But when you realize there's a lot of red spruce trees across the region, if you calculate for a region wide, it reduced carbon sequestration in the wood for about 673,000 metric tons of carbon, which is equal to about not absorbing about 2.4 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. So the trees didn't take that much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And just for context, to try to get your hand around what that means, that's roughly the equivalent of cars burning about 280 million gallons of gasoline. So kind of a big deal. But what's probably more striking when we did this work wasn't just the amount of carbon. If you look over here, this is a reduction in growth with the 2003 winter injury event on the right-hand side of the screen. It's not just that reduction, but if you actually look at the growth afterwards, we were actually shocked that the trees were growing so amazingly well. This is 2010, and we have data that goes well beyond that, showing that growth remains at this really high level. And if you look at this growth relative to the long-term average of these trees, this is going back over 100 years, you can see that compared to the average for this time period, this is extremely high. So this raised the obvious question, what's going on with this? This is good news, this is great, but why is this happening? Why the rebound in red spruce? So we had some hypotheses about why that might be. So remember the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act called for big reductions in sulfur and some reductions in nitrogen inputs. So maybe this is a success story in part, that removal of those particles going in the air, the reduction in acid deposition, has allowed soils to improve in their cations and calcium, and that calcium buildup is having an effect. Another possibility, because remember the decline in red spruce is a twofold process. On the one hand, it's acid deposition removing calcium, but on the other hand, it's also low temperatures causing freezing injury. Well, we also knew that we're having warmer winters than we used to. So maybe the warmer winters are meaning less winter injury and therefore improvements in ground condition and growth. It's also possible that warmer fall and spring temperatures are functionally extending the growing season. So I think I mentioned that as a temperate conifer, red spruce is able to photosynthesize in the fall, midwinter thaws, and spring. So maybe a warmer world means red spruce is capturing more carbon in these shoulder seasons, and therefore improving its carbon balance and competitive status relative to hardwoods that don't have leaves during those shoulder seasons. So those were great hypotheses, but you need evidence to test those hypotheses. So we did an even broader analysis of tree rings, looking at 52 total plots across New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and Massachusetts. So bigger area. We went out and collected many increment cores, and we basically found two things were associated with this increased growth. So we looked at those patterns in growth in the wood, then looked at temperature, winter, summer, spring, fall temperature regimes, low temperatures, high temperatures, average temperatures, and also just deposition, how much moisture there was. and also importantly, how much pollution there was coming down during that time period. We found two things were significantly related to the improvements in growth. One was higher temperatures, not higher temperatures overall, but higher temperatures outside the traditional growing season. So warmer falls, winters, and springs were all associated with greater growth. So that could be both the extended growing season concept, but also reduction in winter injury because warmer winters were associated with better growth. But importantly, this improvement in growth was also associated with reductions in pollution. And in our study in particular, a reduction in nitrogen pollution in a study that also came out in 2018, which is down here. Sulfur was also related. So reductions in pollution were also related to, higher inputs were related to lower growth, but reductions were related to increased growth. And I'll draw your attention to this figure down here, which is a little complicated. This is a correlation coefficient. Negative numbers mean an inverse relationship between growth and pollution. And these are different correlation periods, everything from the basically 1980s up to more current day. And you'll see that years ago, when there was a lot of pollution coming in, there was a negative relationship between growth and pollution. More pollution, less growth. And as we cleaned the air, that negative association started to change. It became less negative and less negative until now there's almost no relationship to the amount of pollution coming in and growth. So two things associated with the rebound, at least as far as we can tell, and actually some other studies can tell, both warmer temperatures and reductions in pollution, which makes sense considering the physiology of what we know is going on. But there's a broader context that I kind of want to transition to as I close. So our group has found this connection between a growth rebound in tree wood in the north with reductions in pollution, increases in temperature. But it's not just in the north that people are seeing this. People are seeing this relationship in the middle part of the range of red spruce, and even in the southern part of the range, down in the Smokies. Those trees are seeing a rebound in growth. That's actually quite remarkable. But it's not just woody growth that's going on. There's an increased regeneration. So looking at plots, survey plots that people revisit over time, you can see that there's more red spruce seedlings and saplings in there. And it's not just in those plots. People have actually looked at satellite data and can see an increase in this green wave moving up a slope and also a down slope. So this spread of the species is evident even via satellite. So this is all, evidence of this good news story, a comeback of a declining species. Of course, as scientists, this leads us with some questions. Will this pattern exist or persist? And I'll just let you know that before we had this evidence, the presumption was that red spruce would not do well into the future. Basically because of climate change, the thought was that the climate would get too hot, too dry for the species to do well. And so climate modeling has made that projection, and even panels of experts have made that projection. But I don't share that pessimism. I'll just show you some of that climate change tree atlas results. So this left panel shows the importance values, how important red spruce is to different stands. This is in forest inventory analysis plots that they revisit on a repeated basis. You'll see that a hotter color here shows that red spruce is more important in those plots. It makes up more of the trees on those plots. And the current status shows that it's fairly important in the heart of its primary range. But if you then project the climate forward, and this is over here, the average of 3 different climate change models at the presumed high carbon dioxide emission rate, which is the rate that is happening now, you'll see the projection is a lot less importance of red spruce. But I just want to emphasize that these climate models are based on the range maps in part, the range maps of red spruce showing that Red spruce, we presume, is primarily adapted to these areas where it's prominent. And I think there's growing evidence that red spruce actually is natively adapted to a much broader area, that we have a skewed concept of the range, and therefore we have a skewed concept of what climate it's adapted to. So some take-home messages. So red spruce is the best documented example of damage caused by acid deposition to trees in North America. There are others, sugar maple and beyond, but this is the best example. Understanding this was a result of a strong investment in science. That science led to a detailed mechanistic understanding of what was going on in the tree. And that understanding helped inform policy, the 1990 amendments of the Clean Air Act and the enforcement of that policy, so that maybe we could turn around this damage being done to the species. So that's science informing policy, and then continued science, even after that policy was made, to verify the benefits of that policy. You can't just make a policy and then declare, everything's okay. You need to follow up and see, did that policy make a difference? And that completion of the loop is really a good news story. And it shows that this process can work, this science informing policy and then science backing up that policy to see, was it effective? It shows a process that works, and it's a good news story, and I mean that quite literally. This story has been covered by National Public Radio, the Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, Miami Herald, and many, many, many other outlets, because it does show that we can do something. We can do the hard work, the science, and inform policy given the opportunity. So as I tried to emphasize just before, there is a lot of uncertainty moving forward. Certainly climate change continues to have impacts, will have more and greater impacts likely. So that uncertainty leads to new science. And there is a resurgence in the species, but a resurgence in the science, looking at the genetics of the species. How might that inform what happens in the future? More work on the physiology. Where is red spruce really adapted to? More monitoring to find out, is this rebound continuing or is it not? And actually, because the species is really important, increase management, even planting of the species. Now, this is somewhat surprising because 30 years ago, basically people managing forests were writing off red spruce. It's kind of a goner. But that's totally turning around, or at least starting to turn around. And there is planting even in the far south of the range, in the Smokies, in the Central Appalachians. They're planting red spruce in part because it's a critical part of the habitat for endangered species like the endangered Carolina northern flying squirrel. So a lot of new stuff going on. So I think I want to just make that kind of capsulation of what was going on. I hope it was somewhat understandable. And if it's okay, if there's time, I thought I'd open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was such a whirlwind but exciting tour, and how neat to be able to say that you started from your master's work in '82 to follow this through. And I think the story of the strong investment of science to science informing policy and completing that loop to ensure that the policy is working, that's just like, it's a wonderful story, and I hope it can be replicated. As a reminder, this is a recorded webinar and we'll have it posted later on our website. So we've got some questions coming in. One from Bill: is winter injury caused by a single very cold event or multiple cold events? And what were the temperatures in 2003 that caused the major decline?
So, so we've come to realize that winter injury is the damage to cells through a variety of cold circumstances. It can be just absolute low temperatures, that just one event knocks off the foliage, but it also can be from a series of freeze-thaw events, and that's probably what happens most in nature. So that if you have thaws that the tree actually drops its guard a bit through winter injury. It drops its guard in cold tolerance so that it can photosynthesize, but then cold returns. That will damage foliage, and that can actually happen again and again and again in the winter. In 2003, we had a combination of a lot of freeze-thaw events and also a large low temperature event. I don't recall what that temperature was exactly. It was in the -30 somethings, but we think that it was probably a culmination of a lot of smaller injury events, because if you damage the cells beyond a certain point, they don't rebound. They can tolerate some of the stress, but they don't tolerate all the stress.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Betsy. Is the current pollution still considered acid rain?
So the rain, the precipitation coming down is still more acidic than we would expect just by carbon dioxide mixing with water in the air and making a small carbonic acid. So even unpolluted air is a little bit acidic. It's not pH 7, it's not neutral, but there's still enough sulfur and nitrogen in the air to make the acid, make deposition more acidic than it is. And I'll just mention that the precipitation is more acidic, but especially the clouds are more acidic. So, cloud is basically condensed water and other things, but they don't condense enough to form a droplet and fall down. And because there's pollution up there, but there's not as much water, not enough to make a droplet or something, the pH of clouds can be 10 times lower, more acidic, I should say, than normal air. So it's still acidic.
Thank you. The next question is from Virginia. If red spruce is expanding, what tree species are being replaced by it?
Well, it kind of depends on what direction it's going in. So moving upslope, it's actually replacing a lot of the red spruce that died from the acid deposition events of the 70s and 80s. It's a shade tolerant tree, so it can also eventually outcompete and replace some of the balsam fir that's up there, which is earlier successional species than red spruces. But it's also moving downslope into the hardwood forest, and that actually makes sense because our best guess is prior to this massive harvesting, red spruce was a big part of those hardwood forests. Those hardwood forests that we know now probably weren't as dominant as we think of them today.
Great. This question is from Michael. Does red spruce have root aphids? Has anyone studied their effect on trees?
I have no idea.
All right, Michael, we might need to get back to you on that one. The next one is from Timothy. Interesting contrast between red spruce being cold intolerant and then future projections predicting shrinking of range as climate warms. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, so I mean, the projections moving forward are based on the presumption that red spruce is adapted to just the cold parts of New England and New York State and those very high altitudes going down the Appalachians and into the Smokies. And prior to acid deposition, yeah, red spruce did exist in all those places and were adapted to even the low temperatures you experience there. But red spruce probably existed in many other areas that are actually far warmer than those, what's now hardwood forests in many of the areas between those little islands of range. So based on the presumption red spruce can only exist in those cold places, they predict red spruce doing poorly. But I think as we learn that red spruce is actually adapted to a much broader range of environments, those projections will be refined and will at least help account why red spruce is doing so well now. We still need to find out what the biology is at these more extreme environments that we may get someday to find out, how tolerant is red spruce to the real stresses that are possibly yet to come.
Thank you. This is from Margaret. Do you expect that any recent federal policy changes will threaten red spruce or other tree populations?
So, any relaxation of pollution issues are not going to be good for red spruce. You don't want to reverse the improvements in air quality we've experienced. But red spruce has been doing better since at least 2010. So, 10 years ago. And remember, in that 10 years, we continued to reduce the amount of pollution putting in the air. So it started rebounding even in dirtier air, so to speak. So if any relaxations now occur but are temporary, I think there's not much to be concerned about.
Okay. And this question's from Betsy. She's a little bit confused about the last maps you showed with the yellow and red showing. Can you maybe go back one slide? I think that was the tree atlas.
Yep. So what this shows is the blue outline here. That's the range map that made in 1971 from Little, Forest Service employee. So that's where they, based on ground surveys and discussion with experts, they knew red spruce did grow back in 1971. These colors are the importance values, how important red spruce is on the landscape based on Forest Inventory and Analysis, FIA, ground surveys. So red spruce may exist in all these areas circled in blue, but it's most important in these areas that are in yellow, red, and orange. So this is what it looks like today based on these ground surveys, and that's where the red spruce not only exists in these blue areas, but is really important. And based on assumptions of red spruce's environmental tolerances and doing climate change models, mathematical models showing how the climate is likely to change, temperatures and precipitation, moving forward in time, this is what they project will be the places, these yellow, where red spruce is most important, but less important than these reds and oranges here. So this is just a projection where they think, based on the current understanding of what red spruce's environmental tolerances are, where it might exist. And my point was just that I think this is selling red spruce short because data shows that it is doing really great in even these other areas, at least now.
Great, thank you from Betsy. She appreciates that clarification. And so far, our last question is from Bill. Is there any relationship between fir waves and red spruce decline, such as what you see on Katahdin in Maine?
So I haven't kept up on the literature on fir waves. My understanding, and it's good, this is from 25, 30 years ago, was that fir waves are due to some kind of a disturbance in a fir stand, and which then opens up the stand and then makes it more vulnerable to further wind throw, ice damage, and other things. And it then pushes that edge of that opened up area further. Then that stand is damaged. And then again, there's a new edge to the damage. That's more exposed, that gets damaged. And that creates a kind of a domino effect of these fir trees dying. But in the back end of that domino effect, there's new fir trees being seeded in and growing. And so it looks like a progression of damage through the forest. So I'll just comment that I don't know anyone's looked at how red spruce decline might be associated with that. However, I will note that in many of these stands that appear to be pure fir now, our best evidence is that they were once a more mixed forest of spruce and fir. And at least in my mind, if you have a more mixed forest, this idea of this uniform damage and wave would be more muted.
Excellent, thank you. And I think a great one to end on is from Margaret. What is your favorite tree and why? Is it red spruce?
Yes, it is red spruce. I have red spruce, and I go back a long ways.
It certainly sounds it.
I've studied a lot of other trees: sugar maple, paper birch, American chestnut restoration, American elm restoration, many species in many places. Yellow cedar decline in Alaska, which is another interesting story about climate change. I've come back to red spruce time and time again in my career, and I'm very happy to be a part of not only understanding what went wrong with it, but to see it coming back and start to understand that as well.
Wonderful. Well, Paul, thank you so much for your wonderful overview. I mean, it's fascinating to see everything from all the experiments from helicopters dispersing calcium to where we are today, and the incredible amount of tree analysis and reading tree rings and all that work. We appreciate you. I think all these questions. Oh, we got one more thing from Bill. Paul, I hope you don't retire anytime soon, as you've done such great work. And I think that sums it up for me as well. So thank you so much for all your time and energy, and thank you so much for sharing this with us. We appreciate you, and hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right, take care, everybody. Bye now.
Bye.